Hello, my name is Mrs. Blaine and I'm one of the governors at your school. And with Book Week coming up, Mr. File asked if we governors could read or tell you about one of our favourite books. Well, in my case, it was a bit difficult because I don't have a favourite book. I have a whole set of books and they're all to do with an extraordinary imaginary country called Narnia. And when I was very little, I had the books read to me and then I read them for myself. And even now, I sometimes read bits of them because they are fabulous. And the stories are so amazing because the wonderful thing about Narnia is it has animals and people, it has wizards and queens and just about every sort of imaginary creature you could think of. And if you look closely here, next to the unicorn is a very strange little creature who is called a faun. Now we know about fauns in stories. Thousands of years ago, the Romans and the Greeks were talking about fauns because, as you can see, they were half man and the other half was a goat. So instead of legs and feet, it had goat's legs and little hooves, and on its head it had little horns. And these creatures were called fauns, and at the very, very beginning of the book, that's where you meet him. Because the book starts with 4 children who were called Peter, Susan, Edmund and Lucy. And they were sent off to stay with their uncle. Now their uncle had a big old house and a big old garden. And when they got there, they were quite excited to have a look round, but it was raining. So they couldn't go and play in the garden, so they started to explore the house. And at one point, they found this. They found a room that they thought was really boring because there's nothing in it apart from a very big wardrobe. Well, Peter and Edmund and Susan went off, but Lucy thought, I'd actually like to see what's in the wardrobe. And when she opened it, she couldn't really believe her eyes. It was full of coats, but not ordinary coats. These were wool and fur coats, long fur coats. And they were a bit mouldy and old, a bit smelly. But when Lucy touched them, she loved the feel of them against her skin. So she stepped into the wardrobe and started to have a look round. And it was a huge wardrobe because it had more than one layer of coats in it. And when she went a bit further into the wardrobe, there were even more fur coats. Now by now it was quite dark in the wardrobe, but she remembered to leave the door open. And she put her hands forward because she thought, in a minute now, I'll hit the back of the wardrobe. But the further she went into the wardrobe, the more wardrobe there seemed to be, until something very strange happened. Because instead of standing on the hard wood of the wardrobe floor, she felt that she was standing on something that was very powdery and soft and very cold. And when she looked down at her feet, she was standing in snow. And as soon as it happened, as if by magic, instead of the soft fur that she'd been feeling, she felt that she'd got something that was hard and prickly. It feels a bit like wood, thought Lucy, branches from a tree. And as soon as she saw this and felt this, she blinked and she was in a forest. But not just any ordinary forest, because this forest was covered in deep, deep snow. It was so beautiful that she just stood there. And then she noticed that there was a light ahead of her. Now, she did a quick look behind, thinking, well, if things aren't good, I can pop back through the wardrobe, but I better go and see what the light is, because she was a very inquisitive and an incredibly brave little girl. We're never going to believe it, because when she came to where the light was, what did she find but an old light, a very old lamppost. What on earth is that doing in the middle of a wood, thought Lucy. But as she was looking and thinking about it, she suddenly heard a little tip-tap, 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 tip-tap. And out of the wood came a very strange little creature. Lucy had never seen anything like this before. His legs looked like a goat, and instead of feet, he had hooves. But the top half of him, apart from two little horns, looked just like a man. And round his neck he had a big red scarf, and he was holding an umbrella that was covered in snow. And in his arms he had a lot of parcels. In fact, it looked as if he'd just been Christmas shopping. Well, Lucy was looking at him, and when she saw him, she couldn't help it. She went, "Ah!" At which the fawn, because that's who we know he is, looked up and saw Lucy for the first time. He was so surprised that he dropped all his parcels onto the floor. He said. Now, Lucy was very mannerly. She'd been brought up to be a very mannerly little girl. So she said, "Good evening." The fawn looked at her in amazing. Good evening, good evening to you," he said. But excuse me, what are you doing here?" "I don't really know," said Lucy. I don't know how I got into this wood." "Wood?" said the fawn. "This isn't a wood. This is a magical land of Narnia, where there are mountains and forests and seas and lakes and streams and castles and cities and every sort of creature and animal that you could imagine." "Never heard of Narnia," said Lucy. But then the fawn had remembered his manners and said, "What's your name?" "My name's Lucy," said Lucy. "Oh, well, I'm called Mr." And then he looked at her, and he looked at her very hard. "Are you a little girl?" he said. "Of course I'm a girl," said Lucy. Are you human?" "Of course I'm a human girl." Now, when the fawn heard this, he took a step back. I'm so sorry," he said. My name is Mr. Tumnus, and I've never met a little girl before. In fact, in Narnia, we have everything you could imagine, but we don't have any human beings." And this is the beginning of their friendship. And Mr. Tumnus invited Lucy for tea, and then she thought, "I got to go home." So she ran back towards guided by the light of the lamppost, back through the wardrobe, and went rushing off to tell her sister and brothers. Well, you can imagine. They didn't believe her at all. A land called Narnia and a weird creature who could talk to you. So they decided the only way to prove Lucy wrong was to all climb into the wardrobe and climbed out the other side. And this is what they found when they went to the other side. And if you look carefully, you can see the lamppost and Mr. Tumnus and the children coming through the door of the wardrobe. You can see a castle in the background, and this is the forest of Narnia, deep, deep under the snow. But what the children couldn't see is coming through the snow on an ice sledge was the queen, the Ice Queen. And she didn't like children. She'd never met any, but she didn't want them in Narnia. And that was the start of their first adventure. And before I go, I just want to ask you a question. I've got a daughter. I wonder what you think. I wonder if you can guess what her name is. Well, I hope to see you soon when I could bring the big pop-up book into school and share it with you. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.